Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming. Before we start this video, I do want to remind you guys that I just launched a Patreon for the channel. Thank you very much to those who have already subscribed. Right now I'm currently offering early access to all my videos. I upload them to Patreon first before they're released on YouTube, without ads of course. But I am hoping to implement more features and benefits for our subscribers in the near future. And of course, any support through there is greatly appreciated and helps me invest more of my time into the channel. There will be a link in the bio of this video, so please do, if you can, go check it out. But today we are continuing our bolt action unit guide in the headquarters section and moving on to some of our higher senior officers, which will be our captains and majors. And much like our standard officers in our previous video, these guys are going to represent a sort of chain of command manipulation of the battlefield. However, unlike the first and second lieutenant, they are not a core composition of your reinforced platoon, meaning they are not mandatory, and will in fact reside in their own category within the reinforced platoon. Now, this has its ups and its downs. However, I will say that mostly I think it is a bit of a drawback for this unit, because as we all know, your reinforced platoon still does need one of those first or second lieutenants on that lower level command structure that is a mandatory slot that you have to have filled in order to have a functional, legal reinforced platoon. So it's not just a sliding scale of power and points with your officer going from low level to high. If you do want to run one of these high command officers, you do need to have another one of those first or second lieutenants in your list alongside him, which can get pretty points heavy in the command structure. However, on the plus side, that means you can potentially have two officers in a single list, really dominating your order activation and maximizing on those snap 2 orders that we covered in the last video and will cover again later on here. But with no further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the unit composition itself and how much they're pointed at, starting with the lesser of the two high command options here, which of course is the captain. Now, the overall unit breakdown here is going to be pretty much identical to your junior officers. The unit at its base will consist of one officer model who can be accompanied by up to 2 additional cronies alongside him, and those additional men will be the same rank veterancy as the officer himself, which in most cases is going to be inexperienced, regular, or veteran, although sometimes you don't get the inexperienced option there. And all 3 of these models can be equipped with a pistol, submachine gun, rifle, and in the case of the Germans, an assault rifle for free. And it is always recommended that you take advantage of those additional weapon options as they usually are pointed in other units. But the captain himself will come in at 110 points as a regular, and will again have that 15-point deviation whether you go up or down in experience, being 95 at inexperienced and 125 for veteran. And honestly, I think the sweet spot for these higher ranking officers is regular veterancy. At such a high point cost for such a small unit, you don't really want them to be inexperienced. If they fail to activate based on 1 pin, it's going to be very feels bad, and having them be inexperienced is going to make them much more vulnerable to small arms fire and high explosives. It's just going to greatly reduce the chances of your officer receiving a stray bullet and losing a rather expensive centerpiece for your list. And while running your senior officer as a veteran to increase their durability isn't the worst idea, you're starting to get really points heavy there, which is one of the major drawbacks already with these senior officers. But also, these guys have an increased range of their command bubble, going from 6 inches of your standard officer to 12 inches. And that makes these senior officers a lot easier to either hide or just keep a little bit further back than your junior officers would have to be. And that alone really does increase their survivability, so I don't necessarily think going veterans always worth it. Although it's definitely not the worst way to spend those 15 points. Now, of course, as mentioned, you can take up to 2 additional assistants with your main officer here, and they will be pointed at your standard soldier cost, being 7 points for inexperienced, 10 for regular, and 13 for veteran, and that experience level does have to match the officer that they're following. So you're looking at a pretty whopping 151 points for a veteran captain with 2 guys alongside him, which is very much in the range of cost of a light or medium tank. So right away you're going to realize that you're not aimlessly throwing these senior officers into your list. These are things that you really have to plan around. These guys are a lot less inconsequential than throwing in something like a first lieutenant with 2 guys alongside him at veteran level. Also, as I always mention with my command squads, I like running them with 1 additional guy, not 2, because then you get to keep the small team hit modifier. So that way your officer is still going to have that 1 additional ablative wound, but he will also receive a -1 to hit whenever enemies are trying to target him, which from my experience goes a long way in staving off incoming fire. Whereas a 3-man squad will have more wounds technically, but will likely receive more hits to begin with, for not counting as a small team. And I could do a whole conversation on how I would like the small team hit modifier to be up to 3-man squads. That's something I would love to see in Bolt Action 3rd Edition, but that's definitely its own conversation. But I think it would be great for list building with officers. Now, with the captain wrapped up, we'll move along to the major, who is the highest ranking officer you can have represented in the field in Bolt Action, at least outside the campaign books. And this gentleman is going to be coming in at pretty much the same squad build as all the other officers. You're going to have your officer and then the option to have 2 extra guys with him with your weapon loadouts. But the major is going to come in at a whopping 150 points for regular veterancy. Again, plus or minus if you want to go up or down in the skill level there. 135 points for inexperienced and 165 for a veteran. That's one single infantry model with 1 wound coming in at just 30 points shy of an entire Sherman. And even more expensive if you really want to factor in your standard officer that the reinforced platoon needs as a tax unit. Very simply put, it is not cheap to field one of these majors, let alone the captain. But as we all know, we are not coughing up all these points just to get a cool guy with a peaked cap. Officers do bring a special aura of command to the tabletop, and these senior officers do get a buffed command bubble over your junior officers, along with that scaling progression we see on the officer table of how they affect units around them. Now, your 1st and 2nd lieutenant do affect units within 6 inches of them for Snap 2 and morale bonus orders. However, these senior officers do have a 12-inch bubble. That is double the size of your junior officers, obviously, but is dramatically an improvement on the generosity of how these guys can be fielded and moved around the tabletop and how many units they can affect. As I mentioned earlier, it not only helps them stay further away from the front line and thus danger, but it will allow you to further disperse your units that you want affected by these officers and get more coverage around the battlefield. And that just means more flexibility from the command level, with this scenario the command being you as the player. And it really takes these officer units from creating a little strike team that you would with your 1st and 2nd lieutenant to creating an entire Death Star blob that can really ripcord start the entire bulk of your army in a single dice pull. So when you look at that officer command table in the HQ section of the Bolt Action 2nd Edition rulebook, you're going to see that little table where it basically goes 1, 2, 3, 4 for both morale bonus and Snap 2 orders for your officers, starting at the bottom with the 2nd lieutenant at 1 and your major at the top with a 4. That of course means your captains are going to be ranking in at a 3 there, meaning they get +3 morale bonus to friendly units within 12 inches. And then also 3 Snap 2 orders to friendly units within 12 inches, meaning whenever that officer activates, he can pull out an additional 3 extra dice and activate those units in sequence. Meanwhile, the major is going to be giving a commendable +4 to morale rolls within 12 inches, and then also will be able to snap to 4 units within 12 inches. And at a 1,000-point reinforced platoon, that is going to be the bulk of your force, or at least the bulk of your main heavy hitters, giving you massive manipulation over the dice economy and activation, and potentially giving you what people would call an alpha strike in each turn. Now, there is something I totally forgot to mention in the last video, and I really wish I mentioned it there because I think it is a little bit more important with the 1st and 2nd lieutenant than it is with the senior officers. But the German special rule Blitzkrieg actually gives all of your officers 1 additional Snap 2 order, meaning your lowest officer there, the 2nd lieutenant, can actually snap to 2 additional units. And the major can snap to an additional 5, which is pretty dang impressive. Now, in lower points games, having a major who can snap to 5 orders is a little superfluous because you're probably not going to have more than 4 units who really need to activate right away. In fact, at that point, taking those dice out of the bag can actually hurt you by not allowing you to play as reactive throughout the course of a turn. But having a German 1st lieutenant who can kind of act like a pseudo-captain is definitely a big deal when you consider that you still need that junior officer in your platoon. And being able to save some points and take a captain instead of a major and still snap to 4 units within that 12-inch bubble is definitely a cool way to cheat some points there. However, for most other factions aside from the Germans, I think if you're buying a senior officer, you're gonna usually go for the major. You're already investing in a massive overhead for that 12-inch command bubble, and unless you're really trying to split your force into 2 different smaller strike forces, one led by a captain and one led by, say, a 1st lieutenant, then I think it really is better to cough up the extra points and get that head honcho major and go full in on that Death Star that you're trying to build. Because, like I mentioned in the previous video, once you start investing into a list where you're revolving around a strategy of snapping to multiple units to hit hard and fast, you are in there. You put the points in and you need to follow through with it. Half measures will result in failure, and when you have something like these senior officers who are serious investments in your list, it's no exception. Now, needless to say with the senior officers, that morale bonus is actually getting pretty crazy here. At 12 inches, you can affect a whole lot of units, even ones who don't plan on snapping 2 with your officer himself. And getting +3 and 4 to your morale rolls is really a huge bonus and is going to allow you to negate a lot of pin markers that would otherwise bog you down. And because of this, it is a really popular and fun strategy to run a senior officer leading a bunch of inexperienced troops, especially units like Volkssturm who have chances to get even better as the match goes on. But these sort of min-maxing lists can be a little bit swingy, although extremely entertaining to field. But the more competitive option is to go ahead and create that Death Star of that senior officer surrounded by pretty heavily stacked units of veterans, or at least regular troops who are just absolutely loaded to the teeth with automatic weapons, or perhaps have good melee prowess. And for quite some time, I do believe there was a Fallschirmjäger German Death Star that was absolutely dominating the meta scene, although I'm willing to bet that Tiger Fear had a little bit something to do with that also. But nevertheless, heavily loaded squads led in a huge blob by a senior officer is like a brick coming through your window, and something that some of the more casual lists simply will not be able to deal with. It's really not so much of a Hans gets the flamethrower situation, but more of a Hans gets the Nebelwerfer situation. Now, of course, on top of all this, I'm going to go ahead and revisit something I talked about in the previous video with our second and first lieutenant, and that's creating a sort of a 3-man shock team to accompany your nearby units as you charge them up the field. Don't do that with your senior officer. Do not give him 3 guys with submachine guns and charge in gung-ho into melee combat. Maybe if it's the final turn, you have the game in the bag. But melee combat is way too swingy in bolt action, the squad is way too small, and they're way too expensive for you to be throwing them around like a first or second lieutenants. Just take it easy, take a deep breath, and make use of that 12-inch command range. But overall, what do I think about these senior officers, the major and the captain in bolt action? I think it highlights really some of the best aspects of Warlord Games' rule set here. It really demonstrates how intuitive their alternating activation system works. And units like these senior officers are great because they're something that you have to incorporate in almost every level strategically, starting before the match even begins when you're writing your list. You really need to formulate a plan to begin with and tweak your units to fit it. And that follows through onto deployment and then how you maneuver around the battlefield and what time you pop those snap 2 orders. It's just, again, the perfect example of how a player should represent the strategic command in a tabletop war game or battle simulation, if you would call it that. It really gets your brain working and solving puzzles not just in that planning phase, but following through to the heat of the moment where the pressure's on, which is a pretty awesome emulation of what makes some of the most famous military strategic commanders successful in real life. Now, all that being said, there is a bit of issues when it comes to the pointing of these officers and things like the standard reinforced platoon having that mandatory junior officer who often becomes a tax unit. And when you have a unit in a war game who has these sort of command rules that operate so outside of just one facet, it does become very hard to balance. So I understand why they are pointed how they are, but I do think that is much more of a burden that falls onto the junior officer there who's mandatory in your reinforced platoon, not so much these high command officers. And mainly, in my opinion, that's because of that 12-inch command bubble range. Simply handing out morale at 12 inches is an awesome bonus that the junior officers do not have. 6 inches is way more punishing, especially in a game that still uses templates. So overall, I think the senior officers are more fairly pointed than the junior officers. And if these guys were too cheap, I think they would be showing up way more often, and then it would really just throw a wrench in the whole alternating activation dice system, which I personally adore. So I'm okay with them being what they are. But let me know what you guys think in the comments section down below. How do you like to run these senior officers, if you ever have? Do you run them often? Is it a staple of your list build? Personally, I'll run one every blue moon. But I actually do kind of feel guilty pulling out that many snap 2 orders from time to time. It can feel a bit cheesy, even if it's really not. And because of that, I do like to run those sort of min-max lists where it's a senior officer running a bunch of inexperienced troops. That way, yeah, I'm cheesing a bunch of dice out, but it's going on to some of the worst units in the game. And even if it does pull out a W for me, my opponent still kind of feels good mulching all those inexperienced infantry. But that's definitely in a more casual gaming scenario. But as always, if you guys enjoyed the video, go ahead, leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, And of course, check out that Patreon page where I do actually have some options for some of the higher subscriptions where you will be mentioned by name at the end of the video as a special thank you to the people who help keep this channel going. And much like our junior and senior officers in Bolt Action, if you subscribe to those levels, you will also be able to make me snap too and produce content that you want to hear, or at the very least make suggestions for things down the road. But of course, I do read my comments section. I do not ignore suggestions down there either. Proof of that being the how to build Italian infantry box set video. I had a lot of requests for that in my comments section, so I decided to follow through with it. So don't feel like you need to be subscribed to make suggestions. I do listen to all feedback. However, I will rush those things out faster if my Patreon supporters do express interest. And of course, all that content will hit Patreon before it hits YouTube, immediately when I'm finished editing the video and without ads, which YouTube is honestly getting really egregious with nowadays. But thank you all for the support and the viewing, and until next time, as always, take care.